Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining CADIO's webinar series this fine Friday. Today, Team CADIO is presenting a case study in optimization decision-making using DAIVE to identify and optimize smoking cessation intervention that is effective and efficient. As you all may know, I'm Jillian Strayhorn. I'm Associate Director at CADIO, and I'm a quantitative methodologist. My expertise is around methods for optimization decision-making, particularly DAIVE. And so this falls very much within my own area of interest, but also a shared interest for many of us at CADIO. I'll just throw out there that, as usual, you're welcome to ask questions throughout today's webinar. If you'd like, you can put a question in the chat. Kate Guastafaro is going to be moderating those questions for us, so you also can directly send questions to her through a direct message if you prefer. We're going to save time at the end for plenty of questions and discussions, so I welcome any thoughts you may have. As you also may know, the year 2025 marks the 20-year anniversary of intervention optimization using MOST. The first paper about intervention optimization via MOST was published in Annals of Behavioral Medicine in 2005. All of us at Team CADIO are finding various ways to celebrate this 20-year anniversary this year, including with this publication from CADIO Director Dr. Collins, also in Annals of Behavioral Medicine. Of course, a lot has been accomplished in these 20 years, both in terms of the successful optimization of interventions in various areas of public health, and also in the continued development of methods for intervention optimization. As you might hear us emphasize a whole lot at CADIO, the field of intervention optimization is really only growing. So in this spirit of celebrating the anniversary of intervention optimization, today we are revisiting an early flagship application of MOST in the smoking cessation area. So one of the very first big grant proposals that was successfully funded using the MOST framework was in tobacco cessation. It was a collaboration between Dr. Collins and the University of Wisconsin, various scholars at the Center for Tobacco Research and Intervention. Today, we're focusing on one project in particular within this larger body of work that was led by Dr. Megan Piper at the University of Wisconsin. And this project focused on identifying effective intervention components for smoking cessation. Now, I want to draw our attention, we're going to get into the details of this example in just a moment, as well as our purpose for revisiting this example. But while I have their sort of prime publication shown here, I want to emphasize just a couple things. This work, as you would expect, reflects some of the earlier thinking in intervention optimization. So you'll notice here, for instance, the term factorial screening experiment. This is what we now refer to as an optimization trial, or more recently, an optimization RCT. But I also want to just take this opportunity to draw a bit of attention to the emphasis here, which is placed on identifying effective intervention components. And this brings me to a big idea for today's presentation. So identifying effective components, or put another way, building the scientific base of knowledge around candidate intervention components is one of the fundamental purposes of intervention optimization. What does this mean to identify effective components? Usually, when we're emphasizing the effectiveness of a given component, we might be talking about important main effects. So, is a particular component associated with an important main effect on average? We might also be talking about important interaction effects. Maybe a component is effective through its interaction with another component. However, our work in recent years has suggested the following, which is something of a tricky idea. When you take effective intervention components, where effectiveness is established via looking at main and interaction effects, and you combine those components, the resulting intervention package may not represent an optimal intervention. This might seem counterintuitive. If we've established that intervention components are effective, how could it possibly be that a package of those components wouldn't be what we would consider optimal? Well, there are two main reasons. The first reason is sort of a methodological one. It's that there might be more interactions involved than we might be able to detect by focusing on the interactions that are statistically significant. This is something we've really looked at in simulation, where we can know the true answer, what intervention really is best, and how close do we get to that true answer when we rely on identifying effective components or components that have significant main effects or interaction effects. A key idea here is that when you take components and combine them, there can be really nuanced synergies and antagonisms that might affect the performance of the full package of those components. A second reason is in terms of resource use. So if you have identified a bunch of components that you feel confident considering effective and you combine them, it could be that that version of the intervention is not what you would consider affordable, raising some questions then about which of the components merit inclusion in the optimized intervention. This is something we've looked at using empirical data, looking at what it means to bring in resource considerations of various types, whether we're talking about money, time, or something else. So this is an interesting nuance that we'll return to throughout. This brings me, though, to our revisiting this early flagship application of MOST. Our purpose in the work I'm presenting today was to conduct decision-making again in the context of this trial led by Dr. Megan Piper, now using the more recent recommendations for decision-making in MOST. In particular, we're now bringing in data on resource use. So in the early writing about this trial, the emphasis was placed on identifying effective components. And what we're interested in is bringing in resources and strategically balancing the effectiveness of the intervention with that resource use. This is an ongoing project that's in preparation, and I'll just give shout outs to Dr. Piper, who's involved with this work, and also to some CADIO team members, Dr. Cantrell and Dr. Collins, who are also involved in this work. So let's address some of the specifics of this case study example. So this Piper et al. Optimization trial recruited adult smokers from primary care clinics across Wisconsin. The outcome of interest was abstinence from smoking, and this was considered the primary outcome. And what we're discussing here today involves outcome data from a 16-week time point. In this example, there were 6 candidate intervention components that were operationalized with 2 levels. 3 of these, the top 3 you'll see there, were operationalized with on-off levels, and they involve different types of intervention given before what was considered the cessation phase. So we have NRT gum, either on or off, NRT patch, on or off, preparation counseling before cessation, on or off, and then during the cessation phase and after, 3 more candidate components that were operationalized with high-low levels. So phone counseling, high or low, in-person counseling, high or low, and then more NRT provided post-quit. And this was defined as well with high-low levels, indicating for a longer duration or a shorter duration. The optimization trial with these 6 candidate components used a 2 to the 6 minus 1 fractional factorial design. So they were able to estimate main effects and two-way interaction effects using just 32 experimental conditions. Now, I mentioned that in this work, we're bringing in the consideration of resource use. And again, resource use can be defined in any number of ways. Here, we choose to define resource use in terms of the per person monetary resources needed to deliver the component levels. So the gum provided pre-cessation. This is with on-off levels. We're talking 2 boxes of NRT gum versus none. I'll just say again, in the spirit of we're revisiting this empirical example, all of these costs are from the time frame that this intervention played out versus today's costs, though in the continued advancement of this work, I could, of course, try to convert these dollar amounts to 2025 dollars, but I have not done that yet. So you can bear in mind the decade or so. The NRT patch also provided pre-cessation, involves 2 boxes versus none for the lower level. Preparation counseling, this was with a staff counselor, and so the cost for this was estimated in terms of that staff counselor's time. For the other counseling components, same thing. These ones with their high-low levels involved different numbers of sessions and different lengths of sessions, resulting again in different amounts of staff time. Now, I want to emphasize here that in the estimation of staff time, there could be any number of complexities that are considered. For example, it's possible that when there is a counselor on staff, it is cheaper to do some of these levels when they're combined than it is to do just one of them. There are nuances there, but for today's purposes, I've assumed that these costs for the component levels are perfectly additive. Post-quit NRT was given for 16 weeks or 8 weeks, and you might notice that these numbers are larger than some of the others. This is where a lot of the resource use for the trial is based. Or if not for the trial, for the different combinations of component levels. So as I mentioned before, in our revisiting of this example, we define an objective that incorporates resource use. So now our objective is to select an optimized cessation intervention that strategically balances effectiveness, again defined in terms of abstinence at 16 weeks, and resource use, defined in terms of the per person cost to implement. To do this, we're using decision analysis for intervention value efficiency, and we're really using this concept of value efficiency, where a value efficient intervention is one that can be expected to produce the desired outcome without resource waste relative to the alternative interventions under consideration. We'll illustrate this with our results in just a moment. Now, as you may know, DAIVE involves a series of steps. And the first one is a complete replica of the sort of analyses carried out by Dr. Piper and her team. So in DAIVE, a first step is to estimate the main and interaction effects associated with the component levels, and to interpret them. So this is what we do here. We replicate the factorial regression reported by Piper et al. In 2016. This plot summarizes regression coefficients for the main effect estimates and the two-way interaction effect estimates. As I mentioned, this was a fractional factorial, so we estimate up to the two-way interaction. The intervals around these regression coefficients are credible intervals or just uncertainty intervals around them. But the point estimates in the center represent the regression coefficients from the factorial regression model. So as Piper et al. Demonstrate in their paper, here too, a key step is to identify the main and interaction effects that we might consider important and interpret those. So first, since the outcome of interest here is defined in terms of smoking at 16 weeks, which is undesirable from a cessation perspective, we want regression coefficients that are more negative. So this highlighting emphasizes the regression coefficients that are negative and that do not cross the zero line with their credible intervals. These are the ones that you can also see in the Piper et al. Paper are statistically significant. Starting from the top, we can emphasize a main effect for pre-cessation counseling in the desired direction. This is the only factor, though, that is associated with a statistically significant main effect. We can then see that there are a number of statistically significant interaction effects. And because these are two-way interaction effects, the fact that they have a negative sign in the desired direction indicates synergy between these particular components. So there is apparent synergy between gum and in-person cessation counseling, between in-person cessation counseling and the patch. So in other words, between in-person cessation counseling and both types of pre-cessation NRT. There's also synergy between patch and foam counseling and the patch and pre-cessation counseling. So we're seeing a lot of synergy between those patch and gum pre-cessation forms of NRT and the counseling. We also, of course, have to identify these which are not in the desirable direction. For that reason, again, since these are two-way interactions, that communicates that these can be considered antagonistic. So this is finding antagonism, interestingly, with phone counseling and other forms of counseling. So just from interpreting these main and interaction effects, we certainly have a vote in favor of pre-cessation counseling, which had a main effect in the desired direction. We also are seeing important synergies and antagonisms. So the next step in using DAIVE is using this factorial regression model to estimate a predicted outcome for each alternative version of the intervention, where the alternative versions of the intervention are different interventions that comprise some combination of component levels. So for instance, the predicted outcome for the intervention that contains gum, so gum is on, not off, and the longer duration of post-quit NRT, so longer versus shorter, the expected outcome that contains those two set to their higher levels would be estimated using these +1s and -1s multiplied times the associated regression coefficients and summed. This is simply emphasizing that we take the regression coefficients from the model and combine them in ways that fit the associated component levels for the particular intervention we're interested in. all of the combinations of these different regression coefficients result in expected outcomes or predicted outcomes for the different versions of the intervention. And notably, something that is a little mind-boggling about this is that even though this trial used a fractional factorial design with 32 experimental conditions, we can use the factorial regression model to estimate a predicted outcome for all 64 versions of the intervention that could, in this case, potentially be selected as the optimized intervention. Now, we certainly don't do this by hand generally. We're not sitting there multiplying +1 and -1 by all of these and adding them up. Software can do this for us. And in this case, the software has also summarized the expected outcomes using these dots. So each dot in this plot is a predicted outcome. And now, in accordance with sort of typical practice in DAIVE, I have now scaled these outcomes so that higher is better. If you remember, before, the outcome was about whether or not someone was smoking, and we wanted effects to be in the negative direction. Now I've put this in a positive direction, so that now each dot can be understood as the predicted cessation probability for a particular version of the intervention. The higher the probability, the better the performance of the intervention. The interventions here are plotted according to the probability of cessation on the x-axis and resource use on the y-axis. So you recall I was talking about the costs per person cost to implement for the different combinations of component levels. Now we have one for each version of the intervention containing different component levels. So this figure, with its very many dots, can communicate numerous things. One of them that I'll draw our attention to is the green dot that falls farthest to the right. So the green dot that has a dotted line running through it, farthest to the right, is the version of the intervention that contains gum, patch, and preparation or pre-cessation counseling set to on, cessation counseling set to high, and everything else set to low or off. One of the complexities of this intervention is the presence of several high-low factors. That means that the intervention versions that are presented here always involve phone counseling, post-quit NRT at some level, either the higher or lower level. But this intervention that contains gum, patch, preparation counseling, and cessation counseling set to their higher levels is the version of the intervention that has the best expected probability of cessation. This green line also identifies alternative versions of the intervention that could be considered value efficient. However, one of the striking points of this figure is that as a function of the higher versus lower level of that post-quit NRT component, there are sort of two sets of interventions, the more expensive interventions at the top and the less expensive interventions at the bottom. Notably, the intervention in this case that has the best expected outcome is in the less expensive set. So while we might achieve some cost savings by considering other versions of the intervention that are value efficient, in this case, the intervention that has the best expected outcome is considerably less expensive than many of the alternatives, making it a particularly strong contender for the optimized intervention. Now, one of the interesting things about DAIVE is that the methodology does not ever make a decision for us. So this plot, which might be sort of a culminating moment in the use of DAIVE, where we can now strategically balance effectiveness with resource use, it doesn't just shout out an answer to us as to what the optimized intervention should be. This is a human process of identifying which of these accomplishes that strategic balance. In this case, through conversation with the team, in particular with Dr. Megan Piper, we all agreed that the strong performance of that best performing intervention, the gum patch preparation counseling and cessation counseling intervention, and its relative affordability, considering the full plot of alternatives here, made it the best possible choice for the optimized intervention. So we saw in that intervention a strategic balance between effectiveness and resource use. So finally, we can look at the uncertainty around this predicted outcome for the optimized intervention, the one that we think is best, relative to not all of the alternatives, that would be very many, but just selected ones. And I'll explain in just a second why these few are selected in this plot. But before I do that, I want to just highlight that looking at the uncertainty around these predicted outcomes can be done in terms of the original outcome or the scaled outcome. Here, I've chosen to use the original outcome, smoking at 16 weeks. So now we're back on the sort of main effect, interaction effect way of thinking where lower is better. So now we see that each intervention is summarized in terms of the probability that someone is smoking at 16 weeks. I've chosen the 3 alternatives to compare here. The third and farthest to the bottom is the one that I mentioned as the top contender for the optimized intervention, where gum patch preparation counseling are on, cessation counseling is high. I also have 2 other comparators. One of them is the version of the intervention that we can call cost minimal. This is the version in which everything is set to its lower level. And again, because this example includes high-low factors, that includes these 3 candidate components at their lower levels. But this is the version of the intervention that costs the least to implement. I've chosen one other intervention here for comparison purposes. And if you happen to have a stellar memory, you might recall that preparation counseling was the factor that had a statistically significant main effect. So this is the intervention that contains that factor or that component that had that main effect, and everything else set to its lower level. And I can see here that my contender for the optimized intervention is performing best, as was already communicated on the DAIVE output with all 64 versions of the intervention. But now I can see the extent of the overlap, and there notably is no overlap between the optimized or the contender for the optimized intervention and the cost minimal intervention. There is some overlap between these 2, but this is still communicating considerably better performance for the intervention that contains these additional components that were active through interaction effects. So this too further justifies the selection of this intervention as the optimized intervention. So I've said numerous times now that this is revisiting this early flagship application of MOST, and this raises a question. Now, notably, I've also emphasized that we changed the optimization objective. So initially, the purpose of the Piper et al. Optimization trial was to identify effective intervention components. Now I'm talking about the objective of selecting an optimized intervention that strategically balances effectiveness and cost. So I wouldn't even necessarily expect these two different forms of decision making to arrive at precisely the same answer. But nonetheless, it raises the question, how do they compare? And the answer is that they're the same. So the intervention that was arrived at through the process that Piper et al. Report of identifying effective components and the intervention that we arrive at here using this DAIVE process, we wind up at the same choice. Now, you might say, wait a second, you said that there was subjectivity in the selection of an optimized intervention using DAIVE. How noteworthy is it that they're the same intervention when you already knew what the selected intervention was? And to that, I would say, fair enough. However, in this plot, you can see again this best performing intervention. This is the one that was selected by Megan Piper and her team based on the results of their optimization trial. We can see that this is also the version that has the best expected outcome here, and bringing in resource use did not change the picture in a dramatic way about the relative desirability of this particular intervention. Now, one thing we do get here using this DAIVE process that Dr. Piper and her team did not get their first time around is you might notice this intervention way up here that is identified with an arrow. This is the version of the intervention that is the same as this one, with the exception that post-quit NRT is set to its higher versus lower level. These two versions of the intervention with high post-quit NRT and low post-quit NRT, these have approximately equivalent performance in terms of their expected probability of smoking cessation. Notably, this version where post-quit NRT is set to high is considerably more expensive. As we saw in the resource use slide, post-quit NRT is an expensive component. That said, I think it's possible to imagine contexts in which maybe post-quit NRT would not be as expensive, or maybe where giving that longer duration of post-quit NRT could be considered justified for another reason. So using these results to highlight this as another high-performing intervention is a useful thing to identify. Similarly, it's also useful to identify the relative affordability of this version of the intervention that was selected as the optimized intervention. So this brings me back to that big idea I mentioned at the beginning, that when you identify effective intervention components and you combine them, the resulting package may not represent an optimal intervention. In this particular case, there were quite a few statistically significant interaction effects. And one way of thinking about the similarity in the answers we get to in these two ways of carrying out decision making is that these interaction effects really did contain a lot of important signal in this case. This was a large trial that was well powered to detect main and interaction effects. We also find here that now we're bringing in resource use, but that intervention that is performing best based on the results of the optimization trial is also one of the interventions that is relatively more affordable. So in this case, resource use is not changing our perspective in a large way about what we might consider optimal. So this brings us to some time for questions and discussion. I think I missed some things in the chat, so Kate, I'll let you tell me if there are some priorities to address first, but I'll also just say that I'm happy to go back to any point if there are clarifying questions as well.
Again, you are welcome to put questions in the chat. You can post them publicly or just send them to me. You're also invited to raise your hand and ask them yourself so that I don't get your question wrong. Let's start maybe with a question about the example you pose, where you obviously are focused on smoking cessation, but could you talk about the possibilities of either this intervention or other interventions where there are multiple outcomes?
Yes, great question. So one of the really exciting things about the DAIVE methodology is that it is conducive to making decisions based on multiple outcomes. To go back to this sort of big idea, in general, when we identify what we consider an effective intervention component, that tends to be based on a single outcome. A particular component has a particular effect on a given outcome. When we have more than one outcome that we care about, that complicates what it means for a component to be effective. And this is just another reason that relying heavily on main and interaction effects can be challenging in the presence of multiple outcomes. So DAIVE, the method, can readily accommodate multiple outcomes. And I think it's really interesting to think about multiple outcomes in a smoking cessation context where there frequently is emphasis on abstinence, but there certainly could be others.
I just wanted to maybe use that as a great transition to say that CADIO has a library, let's call it, of our recorded webinars. And there are 3 in particular that focus on DAIVE. And so if some of the concepts that were coming up today are new for you, I've put in the chat 3 of our recorded webinars from the last year, featuring, of course, Dr. Strayhorn, Dr. Sophie Green, and then Dr. Dave Van Ness, the person, not the method. So lots of resources for us on our website. So Alex.
Great, thanks. Thanks for holding these. And thanks, that was really interesting, Jillian, and like just remarkably clear. I guess I would like to just maybe add, I think this is a really interesting, this sort of big idea or big challenge that you've identified is really interesting. And I maybe like to add 2 other reasons maybe to put on the list, or maybe and I'm interested in your thoughts about them. So when I hear the sort of more interactions perspective, the thing I quickly think about from where I sort of sit in this world is that our theoretical models are underdeveloped, right? So in other words, that there are problems in that, in other words, that like our effects that we're hypothesizing here are conditional on things that we haven't specified, we haven't formalized, right? And so I think about this as being one of the reasons this may emerge is a theoretical problem, right? That we aren't fully articulating what it is that we think is going to happen, and either because and often there are variables in there are variables that matter that aren't maybe even something as impressive as the Piper et al. Who've got this complex factorial. And then the second thing I wondered about, and this particularly strikes me in the context of this Piper work, is that sometimes the outcome moves as we move from the optimization trials to longer term trials. So one of the things in this Piper trial, as is the cessation was assessed at 16 weeks, right? That's the primary outcome. So, which is impressive, but that's still a pretty short-term outcome. And, most of the components that ended up being identified here were actually things that all happened quit date, right? So the patch and the gum are all, there are a lot of the pre-counseling. And one of the things that I've learned in the work that I've done in cessation is that you can't, in some sense, longer term success is fundamentally conditional on short term success, right? Like if you don't quit, it's hard to get out to 16 weeks. And so I wonder whether the Piper package was really good at getting people started, right?
Mhm.
And I don't wonder whether it would be good at getting people, and so sometimes when we move to the test of the optimal intervention, we're now interested in like longer term cessation outcomes. And maybe our optimization design wasn't as attentive to that. So those are just thoughts and reactions. I'd be interested in anything you have on the
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much for your comments. To start sort of backwards with the the longer term outcomes point, I think that's a great one. And I actually think that that came up in this line of work. Linda, you might have specific input about this, but if I'm not mistaken, this project was part of a larger collection of trials, and some of those had longer time frames or slightly different pieces of a larger sort of cessation picture. And I think that when this larger team moved to the evaluation process, they were sort of trying to draw upon different parts of um, the overarching study to arrive at what they should evaluate. And it's an interesting strategy that they used. I also, I threw out there for this plot, this dot up here where post-quit NRT is set to high. I think that it's certainly emphasized in this figure that that is much more expensive. But if it turned out that that was associated with better cessation at, I don't know how many weeks beyond 16, but a longer term outcome, I think we could imagine the choice of optimized intervention possibly changing to be one where this level of cost was justified for the longer term cessation. I also want to just say that I think your point about theory and interactions is a great one. I think we very frequently don't have a lot of theory around interaction effects, which can make it hard to design trials that are appropriately powered to detect certain interactions. And that's a great point. My colleague Jen Cantrell is here too, and Jen is a tobacco expert. Jen, I wonder if you have any thoughts quickly before we move to other possible questions about the timing of the outcome and the sort of long-term picture of all this.
Yeah, from the Piper work, you're absolutely right in that it was. This was kind of one in a broader set of studies that actually had a pretty strong theoretical basis looking at kind of the preparation. It was more in kind of the stages of change model, looking at the preparation for quitting, that kind of motivational stage, moving people along, and then the actual, cessation, like getting to, an early indicator, a reasonable, like kind of a moderate indicator of cessation, which is what this Piper work was focused on. And then they had a study that focused more on maintenance that had the longer term outcomes. With this paper, we're focused on the kind of the central study that was looking at kind of moderately timed quitting with 16, but we can certainly look at the longer term. I think they looked up to 1 year out actually in some of the maintenance work. So you could do this work looking at that. That would be really interesting. To see how these outcomes look just in general, and then and as it's balanced with cost, to see what really helped to keep people quit over the long term, because that's a big issue, and it's even more, I think, of an issue now as more vulnerable populations are smoking, and other groups have quit. Long-term abstinence becomes a real challenge. So. And definitely something to look at.
I think that this conversation is really interesting And as a public health trained person, I'm always like, of course, smoking and tobacco is the examples that we use because you have that rich theory of behavior change and science behind it. So I'm wondering if we could make a, I hope, somewhat smooth transition here to talk about like kind of like bigger questions, not just specifically about smoking here. So Jillian, with the slide that you have displayed, could you talk a little bit about the resource use that you're focused on here? And the question is about what is included in the resource use. Does it include healthcare utilization or only intervention component costs?
Yes, great question. So in the broader sort of DAIVE perspective, the goal for quantifying resource use here is to best serve the optimization process to hopefully arrive at the intervention that is effective, affordable, scalable, efficient to best serve that goal. That can, in various contexts, be done in any number of ways. For this particular work, we have quantified here just the cost of implementing a particular version of the intervention, sort of from the perspective of if someone wanted to select this intervention for implementation, how much would they need in terms of monetary resources to successfully implement the intervention. I think so. This does not include any sort of healthcare utilization information. When I think about healthcare utilization, I think there could be certainly different ways people think about this, but my mind tends to go to cost effectiveness and a little bit of a subtle contrast between this value efficiency way of thinking and cost effectiveness way of thinking. Cost effectiveness analysis is very much in the territory of forecasting long-term costs, cost savings, having sort of a bigger societal picture on costs. If that really is what matters for the selection of an optimized intervention, costs can be approached in a very similar way here. But we tend to sort of take on a little bit of a more limited scope in the incorporation of resource use here. That's really about choosing among these different versions of the intervention versus thinking ahead to, is this a good use of societal resources? So I sometimes find it really helps to think of it as a tool for selecting between these, in this case, 64 different versions. And there are other cost considerations that might be more relevant in the evaluation phase or in subsequent steps.
Great. Okay. This question is going to be a fun wild card for both Jillian and Jen. Ready? So, Jen, from a substantive or practice kind of angle, what is like the next steps or thinking following these results? Like in the world of tobacco cessation, what do these results lead us to in our next steps? And then similarly, Jillian, for you, what comes next for the methodological development side of these things? So does that make sense? Jen, maybe do you want to start?
Yeah. Well, the thing that comes up for me here and in general, I think would be thinking about other constraints besides cost and figuring out how to consider those in this along with cost or separate from cost. And I think, you know, a lot of times when you're working with providers, one big constraint that's the most salient for them, even more than cost, is time. They are really intuitively aware of time as an opportunity cost. So if they're spending time on a cessation intervention, they're not addressing other patient needs or dealing with another patient. So that's true for cessation or any other intervention. So really thinking about how to capture cost, time as a constraint. There's also, we talk a lot about provider time, but we don't talk about participant burden in the study. And those can, that can be captured in different ways. I think participant time is probably the most straightforward way, but there's other aspects of participant burden that are constraints. And if you're working with communities directly and with participants in an engaged way, those constraints are going to come up, and you would want to consider those and balance those out, I think, strategically in terms of effectiveness and, participant time and burden constraints. So, and there's other aspects of this. I don't want to take up all the time, but there's other aspects of constraints that relate to, if you kind of think about all these together, they relate to scalability, which is another type of constraint. So that's an area that I'm working on in my grant that I'm thinking about a lot. And I think that it's really interesting for going forward in this area and really trying to incorporate multiple constraints and thinking about that.
Great. So now
Yeah,
the nerdy method perspective, Dr. Strayhorn.
Yeah.
What comes next for you?
Well, I appreciate the question. And before I answer, I just want to say that, Jen, I'm glad that you mentioned the participant side to cost, since this is really from the implementation perspective that isn't considered here. And I was thinking about that when I was refreshing my memory on the cost for one-time in-person counseling, which was quantified here in terms of the staff time. So when you have a staff counselor and they're there and they're seeing person after person, it's not much. But for a participant, a one-time session that lasts 10 minutes or something like that, you have to presumably travel to get there in person. And there are all those sorts of considerations from the participant perspective. The placement of these dots on this figure might look different, which raises some interesting nerdy methodological questions as well. But since you've given me this opportunity, Kate, I want to just say that in the traditional way that we analyze these data and summarize these data, this is about the average performance of these different versions of the intervention. So the version that has gum patch preparation counseling and cessation counseling is performing the best on average. And something I'm really interested in is the question of whether the distribution of the benefit for the people who get these interventions could be also different for these different intervention versions, so that maybe these top two performing interventions are equivalent in terms of their average performance, but maybe one of them actually does a better job at distributing that benefit to everybody versus just to some participants. And I think that level of information would also help with a case like this. Here, the decision between these two versions that differ in terms of the length of post-quit NRT, it seems like a pretty clear choice between them because of the cost emphasis. But earlier, when Alex was talking, we were raising a reason that there might be consideration of this top one if we're thinking about longer term outcomes. Maybe there also would be consideration of this top one if we were to consider the distribution of the benefit, like maybe having a longer duration of post-quit NRT enables more people to experience the benefit of the intervention, resulting in similar means but very different patterns of benefit for the sample. So getting into figuring out how to best quantify that and consider that in the decision-making process around the optimized intervention is a fun next direction.
And a tool that can be used regardless of tobacco cessation or anywhere this can be applied.
Correct,
We are
yes.
about at our time. So as the moderator of this discussion, I will thank Dr. Strayhorn for her presentation and Dr. Cantrell for you weighing in and being a part of this paper and this work. If you have not had enough of our smoking cessation focus, we have a colleague coming up in April who's going to focus on her a webinar focused on her work with a online intervention for smoking cessation. And then our next webinar in April will highlight a K award that is using MOST to develop a mental health services engagement program. So some exciting things to come from CADIO the rest of this spring. And thank you all for being here.